On the 7th of October 1949, a production line in the Thuringian town of Eisenach began turning out a new four-door saloon. 6 cylinders, just under 2 liters, a kidney-shaped grille split into 2 nostrils. On the bonnet and on the wheel hubs, a blue and white roundel. The badge said BMW. At that moment, the company called BMW, headquartered in Munich, 400 kilometers to the south, was not building cars. It had not built a car since 1945, and it would not build another one until 1952. Every BMW automobile produced anywhere in the world between 1945 and 1951 came out of Eisenach. Eisenach was inside the Soviet occupation zone. This is not a story about a copy, or a clone, or a knockoff assembled from stolen plans. Eisenach was BMW's car factory. It had been since 1928. The machine tools were BMW's machine tools. The drawings were BMW's drawings. The men on the line had built BMWs before the war and were building them again after it. The only thing that had changed was which army controlled the town. What follows is what a company does when its own factory ends up on the wrong side of a border. Both halves survived that split. One of them lost the right to its own name within 3 years. The other one came within a few hours of ceasing to exist, and it is not the one you would expect. The plant in Eisenach was older than BMW. It was older than most of the German car industry. It was founded on the 3rd of December, 1896, by an engineer and industrialist named Heinrich Erhardt, under the name Fahrzeugfabrik Eisenach, the Eisenach Vehicle Factory. It made bicycles first, and guns. 2 years later it made a car, built under license from the French firm de Coeville, a cane bench on wheels, 4 mudguards, 2 headlamps, a 2-cylinder engine of 765 cubic centimeters, and a top speed of roughly 40 kilometers an hour. Erhardt named that car after the thing you can see from almost anywhere in the town. On a wooded hill above Eisenach stands a medieval castle called the Wartburg, the fortress where Martin Luther spent 10 months in hiding, translating the New Testament into German. Erhardt's licensed Decoville became the Wartburgwagen. Hold on to that name. It comes back twice in this story, half a century apart, and the second time it will belong to a country that does not exist yet. By the end of the 1890s, the factory employed around 1,300 people, which made it one of the largest industrial employers in Thuringia. Only 2 German firms had started building cars before it, Daimler Motorengesellschaft and Benz & Company. Those 2 would later merge into Mercedes-Benz. Eisenach was third. That detail is worth filing away, because Mercedes comes back into this story 80 years later, trying to swallow BMW whole. The Erhardt family lost control in 1903. The Decoville license was revoked, the Wartburg name was dropped, and the factory spent the following quarter century changing owners, changing products, and mostly struggling to sell enough of either. It built cars under the name Dixie. By the middle of the 1920s, the Dixie was a license-built Austin 7, of a small, cheap British design that sold in volumes the factory had never managed with anything of its own. Then, late in 1928, BMW bought it. Understand what BMW was at that point. Bayerische Motorenwerke had been founded in Munich in 1916 out of the wreckage of an aircraft engine business. It built aero engines, it built motorcycles, and it built them extremely well. What it did not have was a car factory, a car design, or any experience selling cars to the public. Buying Eisenach is how BMW became a car company. It did not construct a plant and hire a workforce. It bought a plant, a workforce, and an Austin license, and started selling the Dixie as a BMW. For the next 17 years, that division held. Munich was the head office, the engine works, and the motorcycle plant. Eisenach was where BMW cars were made. Through the 1930s, as the range went from rebadged Austins to the 303, the 326, the 327, and the 328, the sports car that would still be winning races 2 decades after it was designed, Eisenach was the company's volume automobile factory. Not a satellite, not a licensee, the car plant. One footnote before we move on. In 1930, BMW built its first sports car, a tuned 2-seat version of the Austin-based 315. They called it the 315 DA3 Wartburg, after the castle on the hill above the factory that made it. BMW's first sports car and East Germany's future national saloon carry the same name, taken from the same hill for the same reason. In the spring of 1945, Eisenach was taken by American forces. The plant had been bombed, but not flattened. Buildings were damaged, some machinery was wrecked, and a substantial amount of tooling had been moved out and stored in the surrounding countryside, which is the single most important physical fact in this entire story. The factory was recoverable, and the people who knew how to recover it still lived within walking distance of the gate. Then, on the 3rd of July, 1945, in accordance with agreements made between the Allies long before their soldiers reached Thuringia, the Americans withdrew, and Eisenach became part of the Soviet occupation zone. Munich's attempts to recover its own plant, in the confused final months of 1945, were not received sympathetically by anyone in a position to help. The Soviet administration had no interest in shutting the factory down. Marshal Georgy Zhukov ordered 5 cars built. Albert Seidler was installed to run motorcycle production. Within that same month, 10 cars and 23 motorcycles were completed and delivered. Consider what that actually required. Germany had surrendered a few weeks earlier. There was no functioning national economy, no reliable electricity, no material supply chain, and no currency worth holding. And a factory in Thuringia, under new management that had arrived with an occupying army, put 10 cars out of the door inside 30 days. They could do it because nothing about the process needed to be invented. The drawings for the pre-war BMW models were in the building. The jigs and dies were in the building, or hidden in a barn nearby. The engineers who had designed the cars, the foremen who had run the lines, the workers who had assembled them, most of them were still in Eisenach, because most of them had nowhere else to be. The plant was placed under a Soviet holding company called Sowjetische AG Maschinenbau Autowello, a Soviet joint stock enterprise operating on German soil with a German workforce building German cars. For the first 3 years, almost everything it built went to the Soviet Union or to occupation authorities. Reparations, staff cars, official transport. Production for civilian buyers and for commercial export did not begin until 1948. It is worth pausing on what that arrangement meant day to day for the men on the line, because it was stranger than the paperwork suggests. Nothing about their job had changed. Same building, same bench, same drawings, same part numbers, same car. The foreman who told them what to build that morning was, in most cases, the same foreman who had told them the year before. What had changed was the destination. The cars they assembled were leaving Thuringia for Moscow, and the wages they were paid came from an enterprise registered in a state that had, a few years earlier, been trying to kill them. There was no ceremony marking the transition, and no moment at which the factory became something else. It simply kept building BMWs for a different customer. The models were the pre-war catalog resumed. The BMW 321, a 6-cylinder saloon originally launched in 1938, went back into production and stayed there. 8,996 of them were built in Eisenach between 1945 and 1950, against 3,814 built there before the war. The post-war Soviet-administered factory built more than twice as many 321s as BMW itself ever had. Then the range moved forward. The pre-war 326 was reworked with a new front and rear into a model called the 340, and on the 7th of October, 1949, it entered series production, alongside an ambulance version and an estate. The 327 Coupe, first launched in 1937, came back too. All of it carried the blue and white roundel and the twin kidney grille and the name BMW, because as far as anyone in Eisenach was concerned, that was simply what the factory was called. 400 kilometers to the south, the situation was close to hopeless. BMW's Munich facilities had been badly damaged in the war, and the Munich plant itself was in ruins. Worse than the physical destruction was the legal position. BMW had spent the war building aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. Under the terms of the German surrender, the company was not permitted to build motorcycles at all, let alone aero engines. It survived by making cooking pots and bicycles, and by repairing whatever was brought to it. In 1947, the American authorities in Bavaria granted BMW permission to resume motorcycle production, and here the company discovered exactly how little of itself it still had. There were no plans, no blueprints, no schematic drawings, nothing. Every technical document the company owned was in Eisenach. BMW's engineers in Munich had to reverse engineer their own pre-war motorcycle from surviving examples and from memory. The result was the R24, launched in 1948, a single-cylinder machine derived from the pre-war R23. It was the first post-war BMW motorcycle built in West Germany, and it existed because a group of men in a bombed-out factory rebuilt their own product from the outside in. It is difficult to overstate how thin the company was at this point. BMW in Munich had been an aircraft engine manufacturer that also made motorcycles and owned a car plant somewhere else. Two of those three things were now illegal, and the third was in another country. What was left in Bavaria was a workforce, a badly damaged site, and an engineering department with a great deal of talent and almost nothing to apply it to. For roughly 3 years, the most commercially successful product of the Bayerische Motorenwerk was cookware. Cars were further away still. In 1947, BMW commissioned its engineering department to begin work on a new luxury saloon, which eventually emerged as the 501, a large, expensive, slow-selling car that would take until 1952 to reach production and would lose money for most of its life. So set the two halves side by side as they stood in 1949. In Eisenach, an intact factory, complete documentation, an experienced workforce, series production of a 6-cylinder saloon, and a badge that said BMW. In Munich, a ruin, no drawings, a reverse-engineered motorcycle, a car that was 3 years from the showroom, and the legal ownership of a trademark that somebody else was using. By 1950, BMW in Munich had decided to fight. The question was what, exactly, it could fight over. Not the factory. The company had already tried that. Its attempts to recover the Eisenach plant through West German courts had gone nowhere, and the reason was structural rather than legal. A court in the Federal Republic could rule whatever it liked about a factory in the Soviet zone, and nobody in Eisenach would have any reason to read the judgment. The building was on the other side of a line that West German bailiffs could not cross. Ownership of the site, in any practical sense, was gone. Not the machinery. Same problem in the same place. Not the models. The 321, the 326, the 327, the 340. Those designs had been drawn by BMW engineers in that building before the war, and no court could hand them back either. What remained was the name. And the name was interesting, because unlike the factory, the name traveled. A car built in Eisenach for a customer in Eisenach was beyond Munich's reach entirely. But a car built in Eisenach and shipped west to a buyer in Belgium or Sweden or the Netherlands crossed into jurisdictions where a West German trademark judgment carried real weight. That was the pressure point, and it was a precise one, because those westbound cars were the ones the Soviet holding company cared most about. Cars sold inside the Eastern Bloc earned soft currency of limited use. Cars sold to Western buyers earned hard currency, and hard currency was the entire commercial argument for exporting at all. So in 1950, BMW AG went to court against Autoello, not to reclaim a plant, but to establish that the vehicles coming out of that plant were not BMWs. On the 17th of November, 1950, the district court in Dusseldorf ruled. If the Eisenach factory continued to produce vehicles under the name BMW, its foreign currency earning exports faced seizure. Read that judgment carefully, because of what it does and does not do. It does not shut the factory. It does not stop a single car from being built. It does not return 1 square meter of Thuringia to Bavarian ownership. What it does is make the badge expensive. Every car that left Eisenach for a Western market wearing a blue and white roundel became a car that could be impounded on arrival. BMW had not won its factory back. It had won the right to be the only company allowed to call itself BMW, which, in 1950, meant winning the right to a name it was barely using, attached to a car it was not yet building, against a factory that was building 6-cylinder saloons every working day. It is worth being fair to Munich here, because the temptation in a story like this one is to reach for a villain, and Munich does not really fit. The company was not stealing anything. It was not suing a rival for building a better product. It was a bombed-out engine works with no drawings, no car, and one asset left in the world. 4 letters and a roundel, watching that asset get attached to somebody else's output at a rate it could not begin to match. Any company would have sued. Most would have sued sooner. But the effect was that the older, larger, better equipped, more experienced of the 2 BMW car operations was legally stripped of the name it had been building cars under for 22 years, in favor of a company that at that moment could not build a car at all. The mechanics of the handover took another 18 months, and they were tangled up in something bigger than a trademark. In 1951, the Eisenach Works was folded into EFA, East Germany's Industrial Vehicle Association. On the 5th of June 1952, the Soviets formally spun the factory out of Ottawello and handed it to the East German state, which renamed it VEBIFA, Automobilfabrik EMW Eisenach. EMW, Eisenacher Motorenwerk, the Eisenach Motor Works. 3 letters, 2 of them unchanged. The new name needed a new emblem, and the one Eisenach chose is the most revealing object in this entire story. BMW's roundel is a circle quartered into 4 segments, alternating blue and white, the colors of the Bavarian state flag, arranged in a pattern that the company had spent decades encouraging people to read as a spinning propeller. EMW kept the circle, kept the quartering, kept the proportions, the typeface style, the placement on the bonnet and on the wheel hubs, and changed the blue to red. Not a different design, the same design, recolored. Bavaria's blue swapped for the red of the workers' flag. Anyone glancing at an EMW from 10 meters away saw a BMW and was meant to. The grille stayed too, because the grille was the other thing Munich had gone to court over. Those twin kidney nostrils were as much a BMW signature as the roundel, and they remained on the front of the 340 until the last one was built. Now here is the detail that makes the whole arrangement clear, and it is the detail worth remembering out of this entire episode. From the 1st of July, 1952, EMW badges were fitted to the cars, at least according to the sources, to the vehicles being exported to the West. On cars delivered to customers inside the socialist countries, BMW emblems reportedly continued to be fitted for some time afterwards. Think about what that means on the factory floor. 2 identical cars come down the same line on the same morning, built by the same men from the same parts. One is going to a buyer in Western Europe, one is going to a ministry in Poland, and at the end of the line, somebody fits a different badge to each because the Dusseldorf judgment only has teeth in one of those 2 directions. The name of the car was not a fact about the car, it was a fact about the border it was going to cross. Which is, when you strip everything else away, the most honest summary of what BMW actually won in 1950. It did not win the factory, the tooling, the drawings, the workforce, or the models. It won the right to control what those cars were called in the half of the world where a West German court order meant something. In the other half, for a while longer, they were still BMWs. One more thing about that emblem, since it says something about how the story is remembered. EMW-badged motorcycles and cars are now sought after by collectors, and they are sought after precisely because of the red roundel. The thing that was imposed on the factory as a mark of its defeat is now the reason the surviving vehicles are interesting. A BMW 340 is a footnote in a large company's history. An EMW 340 is the only physical evidence that this ever happened. That situation could not last, and it did not. The 4-stroke, 6-cylinder cars, the real pre-war BMW designs, the 340 developed further into the 3402, the 327 into the 327/3, and the R35 motorcycle, were all discontinued in 1955. With them, the EMW name went out of use as a car mark. In total, Eisenach built somewhere over 21,200 340s and around 400 327s. Add everything else, and the factory's 4-stroke car production between 1945 and 1955 came to a little over 30,800 vehicles. 30,000 cars that were BMWs when they were designed, BMWs when they were built, and, depending on their destination and the year, either BMWs or EMWs when they were sold. There is a strange and rather magnificent side plot running alongside all of this, and it exists because a government decided that motor racing was a form of political argument. At the beginning of 1951, the East German government commissioned a group of vehicle designers with an explicit brief: build a competitive racing car and use it to demonstrate the efficiency of socialist industry in international road racing. The team was set up at the testing office of the BMW in Berlin-Johannisthal, first under Ernst Ring and later under Arthur Rosenhammer. The car they were told to base it on was the BMW 328. This is the same 328 that had been designed and built at Eisenach in the late 1930s and that had won the Mille Miglia in 1940. 15 years after it was drawn, on the other side of a political division that did not exist when it was designed, a socialist state chose that specific car as the foundation for proving the superiority of its own economic system. It half worked. In 1952, a racing sports car developed from the BMW design, designated R1, won at the Avis circuit in Berlin. After that season, the racing collective was relocated to Eisenach itself, where it continued as the EMW Racing Collective, inheriting the vehicles from Johannisthal, along with 4 cars the Eisenach Works had built back in 1950 on the basis of the 328 and the 340. The inherited machinery was worn out and obviously not going to be competitive for another season, so the team started designing a new 1.5-liter racing car from scratch. And in 1953, EMW entered Formula One. Not as a privateer, not as an entrant running somebody else's chassis, as a constructor. The team appeared at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, the only Formula One race EMW ever contested, and retired after 12 laps with an exhaust problem. 12 laps, 1 race. That is the entire Formula One history of the Eisenach Motor Works. There is no trophy and no result to celebrate there. What there is the fact of the entry itself. The factory, formally stripped of the BMW name in June 1952, turned up at the World Championship 15 months later under its own new initials, in a car descended from a BMW. The racing program continued under the AWE name through 1956, and the cars were fast enough to matter in Eastern Bloc competition. But the Formula One entry is the moment worth holding on to, because of the sheer improbability of the sequence. A pre-war Bavarian sports car, built in a Thuringian factory, developed by a state that had just been forced to stop calling that factory BMW, entering the World Championship under a name invented 11 months earlier and lasting 12 laps. Now we go back to Munich, 7 years after the Dusseldorf judgment, and everything inverts. By the end of the 1950s, BMW was close to financial collapse. The problem was not engineering. The problem was that the company had no coherent idea of what it was selling and had built 2 products at opposite extremes of the market, neither of which made money. At the top was the 507, a 2-seat roadster designed for the American market and one of the most beautiful cars anyone in Germany has ever built. It was also hand-finished, ruinously expensive to produce, and priced so high that it sold in the hundreds. Everyone built lost money. It is now worth several $1 million a car, which is a fact of no use whatsoever to a company trying to meet a payroll in 1959. At the bottom was the Isetta, a bubble car, licensed from an Italian refrigerator manufacturer, with a single door that was the entire front of the vehicle and a motorcycle engine behind the driver. It sold in large numbers to people who could not afford a car, at a margin appropriate to people who could not afford a car. Between the two, a hand-built luxury roadster and a licensed bubble car, there was nothing. No mid-range saloon. No product for the people actually buying cars in the West German economic miracle. That gap was where Mercedes, Opel, and Volkswagen were making their money, and BMW had nothing to put in it. The BMW 700, launched in 1959, was the beginning of an answer. It was a small rear-engined saloon and coupe. It was a good car. It raced successfully, and by the time production ended in November 1965, more than 188,000 had been sold. But in December 1959, it was 3 months old and had not yet fixed anything. So on the 9th of December, 1959, BMW shareholders assembled for the annual general meeting, and the management presented them with a plan. The chairman of the supervisory board, Hans Feith, laid out a takeover. BMW would be sold to Daimler-Benz, the maker of Mercedes-Benz, and at that point, the largest automotive company in Germany. The terms were not a merger of equals, whatever the language used. Under the restructuring concept attached to the deal, BMW would be converted into a supplier of car bodies for Mercedes-Benz. The engineering department that had produced the 328 and the 507 would become a components division. The name would have survived, if at all, as a badge on somebody else's entry-level model. Hold that image against 1950 for a moment. 9 years earlier, this company had gone into a German courtroom to establish that it, and nobody else, had the right to put a blue and white roundel on a motor car. That roundel was the single asset it had left. Under the Daimler plan, the factory gates it hung above would have belonged to a body supplier, and the 4 letters would have been worth precisely what a components division is worth. There is a detail in the room that is worth stating plainly. Hans Feith, who was presenting the sale, was also a representative of Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank was one of BMW's principal creditors. Deutsche Bank was also one of the strongest supporters of the sale to Daimler. By the morning of the meeting, the outcome looked settled. BMW's own corporate history describes the sale as appearing at that point to be a foregone conclusion. What stopped it was not a rival bid, or a bank, or a government. It was a handful of small shareholders and the dealer network who objected on a single point. The restructuring plan valued the BMW brand and the BMW workforce far too cheaply. 2 men in particular, Eric Nold, an activist shareholder, kept the meeting alive and grinding forward, refusing to let it close on the vote. And a lawyer named Friedrich Mathern worked the other side of the problem, arguing that the terms were unfair and pushing an alternative in which BMW would sell its aero engine division to MAN and raise the cash to develop its own new models instead of selling itself. The meeting ran for hours, and in the end, the thing that saved the company was not an argument at all. It was a mistake in the paperwork. An error was found in the financial statement. Under German company law, that error was grounds to adjourn the meeting rather than proceed to the vote, and an adjournment required the consent of 10% of the voting shares. The votes were there. The meeting was adjourned. The Daimler-Benz offer, which was due to expire that same day, expired. BMW survived the 9th of December 1959 because somebody had got a number wrong on a balance sheet. What happened next is the part that turned survival into recovery. The largest single shareholder in the room was Herbert Quandt, who with his half-brother Harold had inherited a conglomerate of roughly 200 businesses, batteries, chemicals, textiles, metals, which also held about 10% of Daimler-Benz and about 30% of BMW. Quandt had been close to agreeing to the sale. What changed his mind, by his own account, was the opposition from the workforce and the trade unions, and what that opposition implied about trying to run the plants afterwards. Against the advice of his own bankers, he began quietly buying more BMW stock instead, taking his holding from around 30% to 50%, and the group's position to roughly 2/3 by 1960. A year after the meeting, a new restructuring plan was drawn up under Quandt's direction. It was built on BMW remaining independent, with new structures and new models. The first of those models arrived in 1962, the 1500, the beginning of the Neue Klasse, a mid-size sporting saloon aimed at exactly the gap in the middle of the range that had nearly killed the company. Every BMW built since is downstream of that car, and that car exists because a shareholders' meeting was adjourned on a technicality. While Munich was nearly ceasing to exist, Eisenach was doing something that looks, on paper, like a demotion, and turned out to be the reason it survived another 36 years. The 4-stroke 6-cylinder cars were finished. What replaced them came from the other side of East Germany entirely. On the 5th of March 1953, Eisenach began series production of the IFA F9, a compact saloon with a 3-cylinder 2-stroke engine of around 900 cubic centimeters, front-wheel drive, and a pre-war DKW design underneath it. It had been built at Zwickau since 1950. Production was moved to Eisenach, and the car was badged, for a while, as the BMW 309. Sit with that substitution for a moment. A factory that had spent the 1930s building six-cylinder BMWs and the early 1950s building six-cylinder cars that were BMWs in everything but their badge, was retooled to assemble a two-stroke, three-cylinder economy saloon designed by a different company before the war. Between Zwickau and Eisenach, just over 40,600 F9s were built before production ended in April 1956, because by then, Eisenach had a car of its own. In October 1955, series production began on a new model developed from the F9's underpinnings. On the 22nd of December 1955, the company was renamed for the last time. VEB Automobilwerk Eisenach, AWE. And the car they had just started building needed a name. They chose Wartburg, the castle on the hill. The name Heinrich Erhard had given his licensed Decoville in 1898, when the factory was 2 years old and there were only 2 other car makers in Germany. The name BMW had put on its first sports car in 1930, the name that had been dropped in 1904 and had sat unused for half a century. The Wartburg 311 went into full production in 1956. It was built as a saloon, an estate, a pickup, a coupe, and a 2-seat roadster. And by the time it was replaced in 1965, 288,535 of them had been made. The 312 followed in September 1965 with a new chassis under the old body, and the 353 in July 1966 with both new. In Western export markets, the 353 was sold as the Wartburg Knight, and it was not a joke of a car. 58 horsepower and a top speed around 170 kilometers an hour out of a 1-liter engine was a respectable figure for the price. Across 35 years, Eisenach built around 1.5 million Wartburgs, which made it the second best-selling car brand in East Germany, behind only the Trabant. But it built all of them with a 2-stroke engine, and the way that finally changed is the last piece of this story worth telling. By the 1970s, Wartburg's own engineers had designed a 4-stroke replacement, a 1,600 cubic centimeter unit of their own. It was never built. The money was never released. So in 1984, EFA signed a license deal with Volkswagen instead to assemble VW's 1.3-liter EA111 engine at the Barkas plant in Karl-Marx-Stadt. The engine was originally an Audi design, from the Audi 50 and the VW Polo, and it was a good one. It also did not fit. Mounted longitudinally, as the Wartburg's layout required, it was too long. One prototype was built and nicknamed the Nasenbär, the Coati, because of the enormous nose it needed. Mounted transversely, it was too long to sit between the front wheels. Eisenach took the transverse option anyway, which meant developing a new gearbox and replacing everything ahead of the A-pillar. That work took 4 years. The Wartburg 1.3 finally reached production in October 1988. It cost nearly twice as much as the 2-stroke it replaced, and it sold slowly from the first day. And the development bill for all of it comfortably exceeded what it would have cost to simply build the 4-stroke engine Wartburg's own people had designed 15 years earlier. Set the two ledgers side by side, from 1955 onward. Munich, nearly sold for scrap in 1959. Saved by a clerical error, rebuilt by a single shareholder into the company that would eventually define the premium car market worldwide. Eisenach, stripped of the BMW name in 1952, handed a pre-war 2-stroke design from another factory, and quietly producing cars in 6-figure volumes, continuously, decade after decade, in a plant that had been building automobiles since 1898. For most of the Cold War, if you had asked which of the 2 BMW car factories was the more reliable industrial concern, the answer would not obviously have been Munich. On the 10th of April, 1991, the last car rolled off the line at Automobilwerk Eisenach. It was a Wartburg 1.3, and with it, 93 years of car production in that town came to an end. AWE was dissolved that same month. The site was acquired by Opel. The reasons are the ones this channel has covered elsewhere, and they are not the point here. The point is the timing. In 1950, BMW was a bombed-out engine works in Munich with no drawings, no car, one asset in the world, and a legal case it brought because there was nothing else left to fight over. Eisenach was an intact factory with a full workforce, complete documentation, and a 6-cylinder saloon in series production. 41 years later, Eisenach was dissolved, and BMW was one of the most valuable car manufacturers on Earth. Last year, the BMW Group delivered around 2.5 million vehicles and reported revenues above 155 billion euros. The half that had everything died. The half that had nothing but a name became one of the largest premium car companies in the world. And that is the thing worth sitting with, because the ordinary lesson people take from stories like this one is that Munich made better decisions. It did not. In 1959, Munich's own management tried to sell the company to Mercedes and would have succeeded if a number on a balance sheet had been correct. Munich built a roadster it could not sell at a profit and a bubble car it licensed from a refrigerator manufacturer, and left a hole in the middle of its range that almost swallowed it whole. What Munich had was not better judgment. It was a market economy that let it fail, recover, be rescued by a private investor, restructure, and try again. And a name it had gone to court to protect at the exact moment that name was the only thing it owned worth protecting. Eisenach had the better factory, the better workforce, and the better product. And none of that was ever the variable that mattered. It got one chance to be a car company, on terms set by a planning ministry, and when the system that set those terms disappeared in 1990, the factory disappeared with it inside 18 months. There is one small thing left. In 1928, BMW became a car company by buying a factory in Eisenach. In 1950, it went to court to stop that same factory using its name. In 1991, the factory closed. And the last brand it ever built cars under was the name of the castle on the hill above it, the same name BMW had used 61 years earlier for the first sports car it ever made. No committee designed that symmetry, and nobody involved would have wanted it. It is just what happens when you draw a border through the middle of a company and wait 40 years. If you want the rest of what happened to that factory site after 1991, how a West German rival built one of the most modern car plants in Europe on the exact ground where the Wartburg died, that story is already on the channel. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these still waiting to be told.